This is the second video on Jacques Lacan and his contributions to psychoanalysis. If you haven't checked the previous video on a little bit his professional biography, if you want, and the controversies that he had with different institutions of psychoanalysis during his lifetime, please check the previous video of this playlist. This one I'm going to try and give a very brief account of who was Lacan intellectually, where did he get ideas from, who influenced him, and the idea is that with the rest of the videos we will start seeing those influences appear in the way that he conceptualizes mental health, in the way he contextualizes psychoanalysis, the cure, the technique, the human condition in general, etc. One of the important disciplines that Lacan drew from was philosophy. Lacan was a medical doctor, a psychiatrist, so his training in philosophy wasn't that of a philosopher, and he knew that, so he actually had private tutoring on philosophy because he was very interested. He was a little bit in love with Spinoza, where he gets famously his idea of monism, the fact that you cannot really parcelize or separate, for example, in the case of Spinoza, the material world from the mental world, that is a continuum. And Lacan will take that not only when it comes to the difference between the objective world, if you want, and the subjective world, but he takes everything as part of the one structure or system, if you want. From Spinoza also he takes the conviction, let's say, that everything can be reducible to mathematical language. So that everything, if it's true, could be explained through mathematical signs and operations. Also, it was really influential for him to study Hegel and dialectics, Heidegger and the Dasein and the human condition and the existence, and Husserl as well, where he will take the concepts of subject, for example. But also about Plato, and particularly within the classics, the ancients, it was Plato that he took, and this idea of an ideal, which actually will become something like the real and the imaginary in his work, later work. Also, and this is very much of the time that Lacan lived, is that he was very close to surrealism as an artistic movement and way of thinking. Actually, indeed, he was from very young, he was friend of André Breton, Georges Bataille. He associated and admired and was friends with Salvador Dali, with Pablo Picasso. He wrote several articles in the typical and seminal publication of the Surrealists, the Minotaur. Also, his medical thesis takes the case of Aimé, if you remember this, erotomania, takes actually the idea of Salvador Dali, who said that the images that Dali arrives to, in that he paints, they are obtained by a process that is a paranoid process, that in which verbal metaphors are converted into concrete objects. So the mental products, like for example symptoms or dreams, are meaningful. They have a meaning, and they're meaningful in as much as they're a product of like an internal discourse. And this internal discourse basically is reality, it's the interpretation of reality, but through the means of language. And this is why another big, we can say that one of the biggest actually influences or disciplines that Lacan took into his theorization in psychoanalysis was linguistics, and linguistics, particularly structuralism in linguistics. Ferdinand de Saussure was the linguist that came up with structuralism and the fact that he would see that the most important relationship happening within language would not be the relationship between, let's say, a signifier or a word and the signified, or what the word wants to say. So what is the difference between, let's say, the word handkerchief, or in this case tissue, and this, the object tissue. It wasn't the main preoccupation of Saussure. It was more the relationship between a word and another word, because language would be the system in which each part of the system, each word, if you want, only has meaning not because there is something like a tissue in the world, but because it's related to other words, for example, paper, for example, stain, for example, cleaning. It would be connected to other words, and that would be the important thing. These associations can actually change, and this was really important for the development of anthropology, and particularly structural anthropology. It's born out of an innovation of functional anthropology, in which, let's say, anthropologists would go to study a tribe somewhere in the Amazon and would see that they had like wizards and witches, and they would say, oh, that is the correspondent of our Western medicine. So what is the function of a certain ritual or a certain social status or a certain position? What is the function for the culture of that ritual or that element of the culture that we're going to study? In the case of structuralism, that is a response to this functionalism, and this is the one that Lacan is going to take, was represented mostly by Claude Lévi-Strauss, and it is more Saussurian in the sense that the important thing is not that the wizards or the witches of the culture that we're studying have the function of medicine, so the relationship of this function and, let's say, health or survival, but it was the relationship between the different elements of the culture that would be important. It's the relationship between things at the same level, and not only comparing, oh, we have medicine in the West, so we might have something like medicine somewhere else. But it's a less Western-centric way of seeing other cultures when we study them, and it allows to explain that culture in itself, because each institution, ritual, or another cultural element would be related not to the West, but to that same culture that we are studying, to other rituals, to other social organizations, to other concepts. Lacan takes this idea of structuralism and linguistics and says something like individuals themselves could be seen as a code of meaning, in the most Saussurian of the senses. Lacan says, and this is central to psychoanalysis, that discourse writes the subject. The subject is something that emerges from language, or the subject, more than emerges, is something that is subject, is subjected, is attached to language. Without language, there is no subject. So, in the subject unconscious, Lacan would say, the relationship of words to one another is more important than the relationship between that word and the object it tries to represent. We will hear a lot that Lacan said something like, the unconscious is structured like a language, which is different than to say, is structured by language or for a language, like a language, and a language in the Ferdinand de Saussure terms, so meaning that a language where the important relationships are the ones between one signifier, one word, one acoustic image, and the next, and not necessarily about what this word is trying to mean or refer to. It's the relationship between words that is important for Lacan. Another of the disciplines that Lacan brings into his psychoanalysis would be mathematics. And this is a very controversial point in Lacan's work, because we saw already that from Spinoza, he tried to reduce his ideas to mathemes, grew increasingly complex and more complex and more complex, to the point that even though they might be a very interesting object of academic study, the practical application of these mathematical formulas is not necessarily very obvious. And finally, another discipline that he brings into psychoanalysis is psychology, at that point experimental psychology, particularly the work of Henri Wallon, who was a very early developmental psychologist who wrote about how babies would recognize themselves in the mirror. He wrote about many other things as well. with this idea of the babies recognizing themselves in the mirror, that Lacan writes his most famous work, The Mirror Stage, which is the one that I would try to summarize in the next video.